evening, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday Train, another 2MK stream. Today, we are, of course, having our Guilty Gear Beginner to Intermediate Lounge. This is a US East Coast lounge for the most part, but we are not too concerned about the lag. So at least stop on in and check it if you would like to play with us. The room ID and passcode are in our tweet at 2_MK_FGC. This is a loser stays on lobby, so feel free to experiment, learn things about matchups, and potentially play your secondary or tertiary characters, or just try out new ones altogether if you are quite good at Guilty Gear. You will all be glad to learn. However, this week we're mostly expecting to have a quieter lounge and to some extent a quieter stream. The team's generally been improving at their understanding of their characters and matchups. So a lot of little shifts have been occurring. Has not seemed to change the amount of times we get close to timing out in matches, though. If anything, it's probably increased them. Overall, most discussion this week will be reminders of things, and we won't be carrying any direct topic other than new matchups and potentially some reminders about old ones or space control situation things. So yes, for now, I expect to see Sin, Kai, and Jacko or Baiken. Possibly Sol or Axel. But without a lot of really heavy commentary on it. So with that said, let's get right back into it.
基本ができてない。ソルは一体何を教えていたんだ。もっとも
The team's practice in Guilty Gear is, as usual, mostly just this lounge, which is why, of course, we call it beginner to intermediate. Eventually, we expect that we will pick up enough skills and matchup knowledge to not consider it quite so, but it definitely isn't likely to get any special or additional time, given that the next tournament we are all going to will be Shine 2018 in Boston. This year's Shine does not feature any Guilty Gear tournament, but there may be something. Shine is primarily a Smash Brothers tournament though, so casual setups for other games is at least somewhat less likely. Certainly heavy competition for them. That said, if you are in the area for Shine and you want to get some Guilty Gear, you can always head out on the Green Line to Balance Patch on Fridays to get some play in there. Depending on the Shine schedule, we may even be there ourselves. But for now, you can observe our progress over multiple weeks of basically playing Guilty Gear just here. For people who enjoy various fighting games but don't have time to devote to a lot of them, understanding the little pieces and matchups can be fairly important. Therefore, it is this that we aim to give with our 3 weekly lounges of Street Fighter, Guilty Gear, and Dragon Ball FighterZ. After all, working out what you want to do with your character to have fun playing the game is probably the most important part of a fighting game for an intermediate player. So, we'll continue to do what we can to provide a space where you know what to expect for the most part, and at least have a spotter. And the clinch at 2 seconds with the safe jump uppercut.
基本ができてない。ソルは一体何を教えていたんだ。もっともその潜在能力に訓練された技術が備わっていた。
アクセルのおっさんがさ、マイケル、マザー、はい、さあ楽しもうぜ。お頼みも恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワン、やっまえ。シェイ、畳返し、畳返し、シェイ、見切った。
And a sudden gold burst. But does not pay off this time. Kai is one of those characters who is able to stop the mat more often than others by simply sticking out certain buttons. However, getting the player into the practice of doing this makes it a little easier for Viking to use her good jump-in attacks to get some stuff started. And as you can see, her good long-range standing dust, as well as good longer range nose, makes that a decent mix-up mid-wise. High players that spend a lot more time trying to stop the mat are much more likely to have problems with her jump-ins. Of course, the psychology of knowing when to switch from one to the other can be hard to learn, and it is always at least partially a guess. A similar thing happens in the Axel matchup. Because getting in on Axel requires some tricky movement in the air from Viking a lot of the time. This is primarily so that Axel tries more conventional ways of keeping her out, and therefore unlocks her other tools. The Axel part of this matchup is more so about mobility and reactions than planning, compared to most things. However, good defense will always also be useful here. Twitchier Axel players are more likely to have trouble in this matchup. Unless, of course, they want to, again, build up better reactions to deal with Viking's various pressure-ish things. It is difficult for Axel to hold a very advantageous space until Viking runs out of meter, but as shown in that match, once she gives up the meter for any reason, she's a lot easier for Axel to control space-wise, and the situation shifts in his favor. Therefore, understanding how to build it back up, as was just demonstrated, is a fairly heavy part of this matchup for Viking, and learning how to be unpredictable enough to catch her while trying is Axel's part. In this case, the gold burst helps because you still have enough afterwards, but Roman cancelling it is a big risk, as once again your meter is actually gone. So from this position, we can generally assume that Axel has won, given that Viking has very few waves in, but with that last bit of meter, the mix-up returns. and Baiken is able to close it out. The other part of what makes this matchup relatively easy for Baiken is that at the maximum range that they fight from, Baiken still has more options than most characters that lead into her standard stuff, and a decent defense against Axel with just a couple reaction required. However, Axel does get to use both his mobility and his zoning tools in tricky ways to keep this from going in her favor. Breaking through Axel's defense with a head-on assault requires a lot of non-linear thinking.
クセルのおっさんがさ、怒ってる女の人には優しくしろって。マイケル、まずははい。さあ楽しもうぜ。お頼み。恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワンやっちまえ。トライか。よし。
It's fairly common practice in the team's playstyles that if you have burst when your opponent goes for a big Roman cancel, that you use the burst then just to be more frustrating. And because you don't really know what big setup they had. But it's also another good reason for this. Directly after your opponent has used a big Roman cancel in that way, they're going to be the lowest they could possibly be on meter for whatever purpose. Red Roman cancels take 2 bars of meter and result in that sort of situation coming up. Which means you in turn have the maximum capacity to do anything you need to do, going up against either their faultless defense to break it down, their own Roman cancels to escape, or even their supers. So it's a good small cantrip to learn. Even though it does not necessarily come up that often. Viking becomes relatively strong once you've convinced your opponent that you're going to burn all your energy in particular ways. Since then you just get to jump in. And she is not a character who suffers too heavily if her jump-ins are blocked, because of the range she fights from. And as we've noted multiple times before, team's most quickly learned combos in any game are those meant to take advantage of very specific universal mechanic situations. This is both so that we can learn to capitalize on them when they appear, and just to be less stressful to opponents, as we are often just doing beginnery stuff, or at least intermediate stuff. Learning combos off of situations that your opponent could learn to avoid, rather than the combos that come off opening up in pressure, lessens at least some of the stress and can improve the learning concept. Similarly, once Blykin has convinced the opponent that she will approach from the air, she gains access to a lot of her grounded movements. This is important in all fighting games, being able to convince your opponent that something is going to happen, but specifically, to convince them to pay attention in a way that prevents their focus from being somewhere else. Allowing you to make baits like that one.
一人だけ遠くからツリーぞ。その武器俺のと交換しようぜ。あら使いにくい。やっぱいらねえや。はい、まずはアクセル。さあ楽しもうぜ。
It's always good to have more than one experience with a particular character, to the point where if you do have a training partner or a training group, it can be helpful to figure out who could play certain characters, even if they don't actually want to that much, or have a direct talent for the higher level stuff. This is mostly because simply having a different way of approaching the character can teach you new things about them. And this is true for everyone. Both the person playing can learn at least something, and the one going up against it can get out of their comfort zone that comes from fighting the regular user of that character. We are fortunate in that, since for this lounge, one of our most complex characters in terms of understanding him, i.e. Axel, often has two different people using him in different styles. And there's the trick and the slip through. Part of the reason why this is so different is because Axel can get through the space control of grinders by using that attack. But it is not necessarily a thing that most people will immediately think to do, because it leaves him really vulnerable if he's wrong. Still, if you have been suffering under the oppression of Kai's grinders for more or less a whole round, randomly deciding to fly through it can turn things in your favor. Whereas choosing not to do this allows Kai to continue doing whatever he was doing. The unexpectedness and sheer audacity of the action might be enough to shift the situation for you. Remember that you should measure these things by both your own gut feeling and at least sometimes by the meter available and help available. The reason that the feeling must come first is because if you build up a condition under which you normally do this, your opponent will eventually recognize it. It's useful in tournaments when the opponents are unfamiliar, but in long training sessions with friends and similar, it's a lot harder to do this sort of thing. Eventually, they will pick up on that timing where you tend to have a particular reaction. And since often this is a reaction to a bad situation, failing to resolve the bad situation is just as bad as any other aspect of getting it. It's absolutely imperative that you understand your options at particular spaces and don't get caught up in too much use of the same option without a plan for when you intend to stop doing it. It does not even have to be a good plan, it does not have to be based on anything. Just the decision that I'm going to do this about 3 times and then the 4th will be a switch, or I'm going to do it 5 times because I just feel better that way. The main reason this is good for you is because it helps you reduce your autopilot. Specifically, building up the habit of only doing a particular thing whenever a certain spacing comes up, because this creates some very strong weaknesses in both tournament play and against higher level players. Players who are better at identifying your specific timings and spacings will make your life really miserable if you telegraph what you do a lot to them. And our Baiken takes a very, very direct approach. But in this case again, it really is just I'm going to do this 2 or 3 times and see what happens. Try not to underestimate the effectiveness of this, again not at defeating your opponent, but at stopping you from building up bad habits of your own so that you can adapt faster when you need to.
一人だけ遠くから釣りぞ。その武器俺のと交換しようぜ。はい、まずはアクセル。さあ楽しもうぜ。
So back to the concept of facing this slightly different axle. Fights like this can require entirely different strategies, which can be a harder thing when you're just learning fighting games. Your character's base moves and advantages over other characters don't often change too much. But against an opponent who is either competent or knows you well, but somehow has an entirely different style of play, your style of play has to change, at least in the way that you apply certain moves in timings. In beginner lounges such as this one, it can be helpful to try to figure that out rather than just overpowering the opponent. But we also sometimes will advocate going through with your main tactic to see if it is that their style just doesn't beat it at all, as this is also a strong piece of information. You should generally consider it up to your opponent, at least in training situations, to find their own way out of the stress you are causing. If you do not know their character well enough to speak for them and tell them this is how you should do this, then you're relying on that person to have that creativity themselves. Therefore, it is important similarly for our Axel to find their particular way out of Kai's grinding pressure.
戦闘スタイルの異なる相手から学ぶことは実に多い。私の所作もあなたの糧になれば幸いです。
As it is normally not quite that effective. One of the stronger requirements within this group is often understanding your spacing enough to take advantage of certain things, since we seldom practice enough combos to win off damage or pressure. The heavier focus on spacing, expectations, and timing means it becomes somewhat easier to pick up combos later. As we always say, Having confidence that the situation for the combo will come up, because you have often experienced that situation in your matches already, means that you are less likely to spend a lot of time in the match distracting yourself or causing yourself trouble by trying to set up your combo situation. You can just trust it will happen, because it functionally always does, quote unquote, and use that to maintain the mindset required to use it when it does. It is also less disappointing when you already have a decent idea of how to do it. And you can focus on the rest of the match. You will not get as frustrated or confused by dropping your combo if you were doing decently without it the whole time. It is always our advice that you move from lower to higher level by learning your fundamentals first. It works the other way as well. If you're never in a space for your opponent to hit you with their big combos, or even just very seldom in that space, it really doesn't matter how good their combos or pressure are, because they will never get to use any of it. And it's just easier to learn more about the game or your understanding of your opponent when you can see that you lost because your spacing was wrong.
クセルのおっさんがさ、怒ってる女の人には優しくしろって。だからずーっと笑って戦ってたのに、ますます怒られた。バイキン、まずははい、さあ楽しもうぜ。お頼み申す、お頼み申す。恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワン、やっちまえ。
Baiken's ability to pressure Kai on the ground can often help her to keep up that offense in the air. However, one of the interesting parts of this matchup, at least between these two, is that Baiken gets a lot of her spacing and damage by doing her standing dust and knocking the opponent around. So as you've just seen, the extra development of this is to figure out how best to make that combo work in her favor. Controlling Kai once he's been hit by the standing dust is a little harder than most characters, because of his stronger options on both wake up and at decently longer spacings, so Baiken cannot just raw approach afterwards, meaning that she has to continue the combo in ways that are less familiar and less meaningful compared to most other characters. Whereas Kai's defenses stand up fairly well to her various pressures. This is another one of those places where combo theory actually does matter quite a lot. Specifically, that moment of trying to figure out where your opponent needs to be after the combo. There are quite a few combos that deal more damage, but if blocked, or even sometimes if not, put your opponent in an advantageous position for them, and this is often one of the more character-dependent parts of the game, since some characters can prevent you entirely from doing your after pressure, and some cannot. The combo you use on Kai, therefore, can be different from the combo used on Axel, not even because of any difference in their direct properties or how likely the combo is to drop or similar, but simply that one of them can stress you more based on the position after the fact than the other can. The rest of this matchup is mostly speed and awareness. Sometimes, when faced with a confusing method from an opponent, a player will lock up, meaning that if you can learn a way around their attacks or defenses that is just a little bit outside of the norm, you can often get some advantage. However, this is usually done by having a strong command of your own character. Rather than just randomly choosing things and hoping. As you get more and more familiar with your character, it is a lot easier to find the right things to press at the right timings without thinking so hard about it. However, when you are unfamiliar with a matchup, this skill has to be built up over time. Therefore, you should focus more on your defense and understanding of the opponent's character than on anything else. Johnny, for example, should generally handle Baiken by approaching, as is being done here, since she does not benefit too much from the ranges he creates at the end of his strings. He can easily get in close, hit her even if he is blocked a lot, and get back to a space where he's mostly comfortable. Baiken in turn needs to stop him from approaching in the first place and has to be a bit more daring as a result. Otherwise she'll just get pummeled most of the time. She is not among the characters who can easily poke at him after a move he does, and often must try to get out in some other way or use blitz. In a more familiar matchup, the situation can switch to working on your little pieces of offense instead, as you often have the defensive part of the match at least somewhat understood, i.e. even if you do get opened up or get caught in pressure, you are familiar enough with the pressure to not have it take up all of your mental space just because that has happened. As you can see here, for example, even without the threat of the mat, Viking can still stress out a Kai that they're already familiar with. But a flinch at the end results in layering out strategy not quite working out. Which means we are back to our Axel trying to find a way out of being grinded to death. Of course, in order for the grinders to ever matter, you have to get close enough to make them. And as you can see, this is a corner tactic. It's not exactly strong without it. Axel has enough range and enough options to prevent problems unless the grinder is exactly overhead. There is, of course, the alternate factor in any game of seeing when your opponent has managed their own execution perfectly versus not. If Kai's grinder is too high in the air, and Axel has the skill to recognize this, it is an opportunity to get out. Fortunately, it is also a fairly quick thing for your side. You can see it and react relatively quickly because Kai takes a fairly long time to put it out, and you can see where it's going to be fairly early into the animation of it, eventually allowing you to build up a reaction to that situation.
戦闘スタイルの異なる相手から学ぶことは実に多い。私の所作もあなたの糧になれば幸いです。
But once again, we will see Axel versus Sin.
るのは OK、 暴力を振るうのは NG。ジョニー、まずはおれ、さあ楽しもうぜ。 やっちまえなんだよダセえなミストフェイル年配を気遣う男はスマートだ。だが若さが強さだと勘違いする奴はノーティーだ。これが俺の新必殺技ドメスティックブリザードだ。
as one of the more technical characters in the game. And so users often have to memorize their optimal spacings and positions for a lot of things, as he's a more or less lockdown character, and not so much a zoner. If you know your spacings, it's a lot easier to handle the situation. Your opponent, in turn, gets to learn just how to deal with you particularly, and what positions to stay in, even if they just learn this as an automatic sort of feeling, and not because they actually understand all the theory behind it. This can be stressful to players, because it can feel as if they're doing much more work to achieve the same thing. But if you consider it to be just one matchup at a time, it's really about the same. Your concern, therefore, should be whether or not you're the type that can absolutely memorize everything you need to do for every character, or if you're better off writing notes and having your understanding boosted by them. Just having them there for reference, because no one really wants to have to be relying on direct memory things when they are about to have a stressful match. Once you've become very good at your character, it can be relatively easy to think about your opponent's character, their abilities and positions, and then derive backward toward whatever it is you should be doing against them. However, you do risk one of the most insidious problems in fighting games, specifically a particular form of autopilot, being shown here by Rune Siren's answer. Or at least was being shown for at least a moment. When you are reminded of the primary thing in a matchup, it's easy to do the entire parts of that, all of the autopilot required. In this case, going above Kai's head with perches is supposed to serve a particular purpose. Putting the perches over Kai's head means you can escape to them when Kai approaches you. But what do you do if Kai doesn't approach you? Once Kai stays in his position and is in defensive state, going straight up to your perches is just asking to be countered. So it can be hard to remember both sides of the situation at the same time. And make sure you have enough control of the situation to actually come out on top. Another reason why notes can be so helpful. Learning to think of fighting game strategies as in both sides of the same coin, as dualities, is a skill you are going to need at intermediate levels quite a lot, because there's nothing worse than losing a match simply because you forgot your plan and fell apart. After all, at that point, it's very hard to find anything to blame but yourself, as with other things in fighting games, but that one is particularly heinous because not only can you not blame yourself, so not only can you not blame anyone else, you definitely must clearly point out to yourself that it could have been done. And probably with just a little bit more. It's not as if you had to train the execution a whole lot. You had to remember something. But memory must also be trained. And until it is done, or depending on if you have the type of memory that works best when you write something down, try to make sure to take advantage of this. This is different from having muscle memory issues, where the thing you need to execute in a particular matchup is different than what you normally need to do. But it's still absolutely important to do it correctly. And therefore, to remember as much as you can and let your notes handle the rest. But if nothing else, your notes can also help remind you when you have done something wrong, and you can look back at the match you had and recognize that things should have gone differently at some point, rather than feeling any specific direct weakness or frustrated with yourself based on execution or just a vague concept of not being good enough at the game. It's always better to be able to break down what you did wrong so you can at least feel as if you can fix it. So in the case of Johnny versus Answer, which is not a common thing with notes, the main problem that is faced by Answer is that he doesn't have enough time once Johnny's pressure starts. However, he can counter his way out of a ton of things once Johnny has created enough space between the two characters. And this is easy because of the basic principle of fighting Johnny as a generality: block. Once you have a decent idea of when Johnny's pressure will continue or stop by blocking him enough, you can get your position back. And once you have your position back, Johnny is a much easier character to deal with. So, above all else, you must let go of your need to press buttons or try to get advantage, and understand that getting advantage against Johnny is about blocking. Since he cannot run or vary his spacings too much, you're watching for your openings. Without doing that, you generally will just get destroyed because he'll eventually clip you, and he has some of the strongest conversion ability in the game. Your health just basically melts away because you didn't block long enough. Eventually, however, once Johnny realizes that it's almost impossible to open you up, even with his risk meter options, you can learn the defensive methods that will stop him from being as effective, and from there, you can start to build up a strategy to win the matchup. Anything else is most likely just putting yourself into Johnny's blender, and even if you do get to deal some damage because he happened to do a particular thing and you happen to pick the thing that beats it, you won't necessarily know what you're doing or what to do.
心を精錬することだ。はい、勝ちだ。ストレート。
これが伝え聞くし。
Our previous match saw our Axel managing to get out of a lot of the grinder situations by observing and by making sure not to be so close to the corner. The development of this strategy has definitely made it so that the grinder itself is less effective, but is the counter strategy in itself also less useful because it puts you back into Kai's normal game plan? After all, that's the duality. Often, the thing that you do is meant specifically to put the opponent's character back into a situation that you are familiar with and can play like other matchups or just in the way you prefer. Meaning that the one you need to remember is the one that is meant to get you there. However, a few players do have problems remembering that this isn't the winning strategy for the matchup per se, but rather just the thing that is intended to help them get back to their comfort zone. Your opponent, however, is often very aware of this, since they are the one under the pressure to change the way that they want to approach the matchup. But as we can see overall, the grinder allows Kai to stay closer to Axel in ways that also tend to make Axel try to guard in particular directions and not to do certain moves. Those moves are often the ones that keep Kai from repositioning himself in the air or as he prefers, making it easier to play the matchup from Kai's side.
戦闘スタイルの異なる相手から学ぶことは実に多い。私の所作もあなたの糧になれば幸いです。アクセルバーサスカイ、さあ楽しもうぜ。恨みっこなしだ。 戦闘スタイルの異なる相手から学ぶことは実に多い。私の所作もあなたの糧になれば幸いです。
And so the train rolls on. As Rune Siren noted, the muscle memory for this to place the correct purchase can make this fairly stressful, and even a few moments lost placing the wrong ones can heavily influence the outcome of this match. It telegraphs to Axel that your mind is on that rather than things like throwing the cards to stop him from throwing out buttons, and puts him into a defensive state that makes it easier for him to react to your approaches. The ability to make that attack from that space helps Answer keep his lockdown versus Axel going pretty well. The hard decision is whether or not to go for pressure or attempt to escape back to Answer's optimal range, as Answer's backdash is not that great and he does have specific things that require a spacing it doesn't often put him at. His lockdown is good, but his pressure tends to be a little lacking against characters who are easily able to use invincible wake-ups and similar. So it seems that for various obligations of both the team and the others who were expecting to be around today, we'll be ending our stream a little early, making this our last match of the night. Note that normally our stream goes on for another hour, so if you want to join next week and you're just joining us now, in terms of watching, if you do want to join next week and you're only able to be available from this time, don't worry, we have about an hour left to go normally. Tomorrow, we'll most likely be having more Street Fighter V content, either sandbag casuals with Just Fine Sporty, or looking at some matches that we've played recently across various characters and settings in one of our open mic segments. On Thursday, join us for Kame House Dragon Ball Fighters Beginner Lobby. And on Friday for either Dead or Alive or, based on some research we've been doing based for our bots, a look at our Kata 25, which seems to have been at least somewhat disabled or will require some shifts based on changed behavior of Karin Tanzuki in that game since Arcade Edition, which we have finally, at least partially confirmed. Next week, Monday, we will, as always, be having our Street Fighter V Mishmashing Battle Lounge. And of course, back around the cycle to the Tuesday training. Guilty Gear on Tuesday. As always, we hope whatever we've managed to offer in terms of understanding or learning fighting games has been useful to you in your training and your planning. And you can look out for our various other content and shifts at 2-mk.org, especially if you are a Street Fighter V player or fan. That said, this has been Ridian for the Team 2MK. Good night, everyone.